Okay, Ralph, can you get us started?
Hello everyone, I'm Ralph Pite. I teach at the University of Bristol, and I curated the month in January for the campaign about nature and the environment and how English can contribute to our addressing those issues.
Thank you. Ben?
Hi everyone, I'm Ben Davies. I work at the University of Southern Denmark. I curated the January session cluster on critical reading, and I've been involved in campaigning advocacy this year as well on reading, which we'll probably talk about a little bit later.
Nicky?
Hi, I'm Nicky Marsh, and I curated March, which is themed around communities, and I was talking about a series of kind of place-based projects I've been working on the past few years.
Thank you. Richard?
Hi, I'm Richard Jones, and I'm the head of English and Creative Writing at the Open University, and I curated the blog of the month on lifelong learning and English.
Thank you. Andrew?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Andrew Ettinger. I'm Director of Education at the National Literacy Trust. We're a 30-year-old charity, the country's largest literacy development charity, and I oversee all of our education work in the early years with primary and with secondary schools, and I lead the schools element of the National Year of Reading 2026.
Thank you. And Rodney?
Hi, I'm Rodney Jones. I'm a professor of sociolinguistics and digital media at the University of Reading. I facilitated my students in curating the AI and English month of June, and I'm also quite involved in efforts around the university to help us to understand the role of AI, the growing role of AI in literacy.
Thanks very much. And it's been really useful actually at Reading that it's been colleagues in English language and in classics actually who've been leading on thinking about AI. So we do, our humanities does have a really big part to play in that conversation. I'm sure Rodney will talk about that very soon. But Andrew, if we could kick off with you, could you speak to why it's so important for us to engage children with literature at an early stage, and what perhaps we, as most of your audience are going to be HE practitioners, can learn from that process of engagement in terms of how we can engage our students and indeed applicants with English?
Sure. And obviously I can talk about this all day, so I'll try to give a summary answer, but
3 to 4 minutes.
do stop me if I'm going on too long.
Okay.
So one of the things that we do at the National Literacy Trust is we run the annual literacy survey, which is the world's largest survey of children's reading habits and opinions and perceptions in the world. And this year, 125,000 children responded to that survey. So it's a very robust survey we've been running for a number of years. And the key question that we measure in that is how much children are engaged and enjoying reading. And for the last decade, other than a small blip during the pandemic when children were locked up at home and couldn't do anything else, their enjoyment and interest in reading has been in great decline, particularly 2 years ago where we saw the biggest drop we've ever seen. And that spurred us into action, and that's what's driven the National Year of Reading this year. And I'm very pleased to say that in this year's annual literacy survey, we saw the first upturn since the pandemic in children's enjoyment of reading, a small increase, but the first one for quite a while. We're not claiming causation yet with the National Year of Reading for that, but obviously it's very coincidental if there's no relationship at all between the two things. So we're very pleased to see that. But it is the key question and the thing we focus on the most, and that's because we think children's engagement and enjoyment of reading is one of, if not the most important thing that we can encourage them to do. And we know that reading has 2 main drivers of impact with children. So firstly is the act of reading in of itself, whereas you can imagine with most things, the more you do it, the better you get at it. So the more the children enjoy reading, the more their reading skill develops. It also gives them knowledge. It also, as we know, and children are starting to recognise themselves more nowadays, it supports their well-being and their development of empathy. And I think even though it's not anything scientifically measured, we also want to always continually recognise that reading gives a sense of wonder and joy and enrichment of the soul as well. And I don't think we should lose sight of that. But actually the other driver on children is that it's the act of choosing to read, as Teresa Kremlin calls it, volitional reading, because it's that act of wanting to spend your spare time on reading, which also gives self-regulation, curiosity, and a wider love of learning. So it's something in reading itself, but the choice of choosing to read, which are incredibly important. And actually, as I said, this is one of the most solid evidence bases of anything you could do within the education system in driving attainment across all subjects, not just English, wider achievement, even attendance at school, and then obviously then has the related benefits of those wider life outcomes, including that we know that children who choose to read live longer than other children as well. And the OECD did some extensive research a few years ago, which actually showed that this is a great driver of social justice, that children who choose to read do better regardless of their parents' socioeconomic backgrounds as well. So there's great benefits to children, not just reading, but in wanting to read as well. So we've based the National Year of Reading campaign around what our research over the last 20 or 30 years has shown us to be what really drives children to want to read. And firstly, we know, and you'll see this from the Goal In campaign, that children read things that they're interested in, which again might seem an obvious statement and sometimes conflicts with curriculum and set text lists, but we know that children are motivated to read about the things that they are motivated in, what they are passionate about and what drives their interest, both in terms of the content of the book, but also in terms of the diversity and the representation, particularly that they can see themselves in the text that they choose, but also in terms of the format of how they read as well. So not just traditional long form novels, but also particularly audio is increasingly popular, both ebooks and podcasts, audiobooks and podcasts, of reading on screen, not the comments below a TikTok video or something like that, but actually choosing to read ebooks on screen, again, is increasingly popular, and comics and graphic novels as well, particularly not just as a pathway to the traditional novel, but as an end in itself, that there is value still in all of those different formats. So we want to support children to be able to follow their passions, both in terms of their subject matter and the format that they read. We know that young people having support around them supports their reading, both in terms of maybe their parents and their family. So we work to develop parents' literacy skills where that might be a barrier as well, but also in seeing role models through their peers, their teachers and other people they look up to. Do they see those people reading around them? And is a talk about books in terms of character and narrative part of the general discourse of the family and the school? And then finally, we know that access is incredibly important as well. Public libraries have been slashed across the country. We know 1 in 7, going up to 1 in 4 in areas of high deprivation schools don't have a library anymore. So we work very hard to restore library provision back into schools. And we still know, despite all of the work of us and many other charities to donate books, that 1 in 10 children still don't own a book of their own at home. So combining all of those aspects, providing things that support young people's interests in reading, providing a support network around them, and providing access are the 3 things that really drive children to re-engage or to see themselves as being readers. And you can see this through something like, I'm sure many of you are aware of, the Lit in Colour project, which Penguin Random House worked on following the Me Too movement, where firstly they worked with the exam boards to open up the breadth of the content of set text lists at GCSE English to support a great diversity of text, but actually found that in itself wasn't enough. Providing those wider texts that meet children's interests wasn't enough, that actually they needed to provide teacher training, because teachers retreat back to the texts that they know. My son's just finished his English GCSEs and was struggling with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and an Inspector Calls, the same as I was when I was doing mine 35 years ago, because that's what teachers know, but it's also what teachers have got in their stock cupboards. So the other thing that the Lit in Colour movement provided was additional copies of text. And so by combining those 3 things, they actually saw not only did GCSE English pass rates go up, but A-level English literature applications increased significantly as well. And I'm sure when that cohort moves through to A-levels next year, we'll see an increase in English literature degree applications from them as well. So you can see it's those 3 things combined together, and that's what we've built the National Year of Reading around. So I think those are the things it'd be really good for HE to also be thinking around: interests, support and access to text.
Thanks, Andrew. That's fascinating and really inspiring answer, actually. And I think that we could probably talk about this all day, but we have some really interesting contributions from other people too. I mean, we've been talking there about children, engaging them as a really foundational step, which is fantastic. But Richard, you curated a month on lifelong learning and working in part with older reading communities. So what is it about English, do you think, that really lends itself to lifelong learning and means that English can be and should be sustained into old age, as well as getting it right when people are very young?
Wow, that's a big question, isn't it? Yeah, because that's interesting. Because what I ended up sort of thinking about at the end of curating the blog was that I call it the idea of age, or thinking about age, strangely enough, because working at the university and sort of at the Open University, I'm used to thinking about the study of literature and perhaps the arts and humanities more generally as an important undertaking at any age, as Andrew was describing. But I think the blog made me wonder about, if I'd really thought about the perspectives, those different perspectives that age brings to something. So at the OU, you might have a cohort of students of different ages. So maybe half of them will be under 29, under 25, in their 20s, so quite a lot of young students, but also the other half would be older than this, in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. So there's a big spread. So I think that gives a sort of texture, in a way, to the actors studying. There's some opportunity for intergenerational sort of thinking there you might not have. And so I think I ended up thinking about age as a sort of lens through which we might experience reading. I did mention in the final blog post, I mentioned a book that I ended up being influenced by a little bit, which was Juvenescence by Robert Pogue Harrison. And I think if he was going to describe that, he might say that age was a quality of the phenomena or something like that. I think he says every phenomenon has its age. So you sort of kind of get through that. So if we kind of try and think about how age might be a quality of reading, of the phenomena of reading, if you like, I wanted to do something initially around someone who might have read something in the past and then come back to it at a later stage in life. And actually I found your post, Gail, you'd actually spoken to this exactly around reading Middlemarch, I think, and this sort of continuous engagement with Middlemarch over many years, I think, and a sense of community with sort of your past self, perhaps, and the readers who had also been doing this. So I like that, and that made me. So on reflecting on like what to sort of bring here to this session now, that made me think of that sort of essay by it's a quite well-known essay by Italo Calvino about why read the classics. That's what it's called, and in that, Calvino is trying to come to a sort of definition of what a classic is, but it's really about reading. It's about the effect of reading and then rereading, and I think that tells us something about lifelong learning. So I found a quote for us. I've got the book here. A couple of quotes just to sort of think this through. So first of all, I mean. I'm just honing in on a couple of things. So reading in youth, he says, can be rather unfruitful due to impatience, distraction, inexperience, he says, with the product's instructions for use. So he kind of means, how to read a book, and inexperience in life itself. Does that, although I think he would agree with you, Andrew, about how important it is, the most important thing for children to be doing as well. So we should say that. He notes how formative, reading is, even so, and even if you forget what you've read, But then to read a book again in later life is to glimpse some of that influence that it's had on you, some of the ways it shaped and formed the world, perhaps, in which you're living. So he says, there should therefore be a time in adult life devoted to revisiting the most important books of our youth, even if the books have remained the same, he says, which is a bit arguable, he says. We have mostly certainly changed, and our encounter will be an entirely new thing. So a book, a classic in that sense, bears the traces of our reading and of other people's reading previous to ours. Excuse me. So I like that because it reminds us that reading, and I think this applies to study, lifelong learning, it takes place in time, which sounds really sort of obvious, but we can forget it easily. I think that's why on the blog I snuck in a few images of David Hume and Samuel Johnson, of all people, portraits from the 18th century, just to show how they were sitting there amongst us, readers and writers of the past, so we can reach back and build on them or converse with them. So just to wrap up these thoughts then, I think what can be said about reading there can be said about lifelong learning. So Calvino was hinting that books didn't really stay the same because, the historical situation in which they're written or read changes, the understanding of those situations changes, the books change for us, personally over time as well. So nothing is really fixed, nothing is really stable there. And so in the book I mentioned, Juvenescence, Harrison argues that we live in a culture that denies aging, denies the effects of aging, and it values youth, above all things. We try to get back to youth and stay young. And if that's the case, then we're denying an aspect of that change. It's placing a bit of limitation on our thinking. We're missing out on the texture that age brings. And I think this is kind of what I wanted to say, really. This is why lifelong learning isn't just, a nice to have thing. It's not something you can sort of a decorative sort of add on to the side of a more important aspect of education or something. It's really how things are. We're always doing it. We're doing it right now. That's what we're doing, lifelong learning. And I think it's how, it should frame everything, really. So that's my message.
Thank you very much. Well, we've had two really important messages about the importance of about the essence and the essentialness of reading and lifelong learning, and the way that English is really fundamentally part of those concerns and conversations. And I'd like to throw things to Ben now, because your month was about reading and the various texts that we read, and as Richard is saying, reread. And you've done some fantastic research yourself on paying attention to reading books, and the fantastic book about reading during COVID. But perhaps you could just say something about the experience of curating the blog, what you got out of that month of engaging with some of us as readers as well as scholars, and why that attention to reading is important for English scholars.
Yeah, thanks, Gail. As you said, the cluster came out of my research on paying attention to reading. That book on COVID combined sort of traditional forms of literary scholarship with qualitative research, sociological research, where we surveyed and then interviewed actual readers. And then more recently, I've been looking at reading practices that academics undertake, because often when we read articles or monographs, we often only have, if you like, the end product. We don't actually get the stories of reading that go into that, which I think is important, because as we've already heard, reading is something that unfolds over time. It's not static. Books can change, or we can have different interpretations depending on where and when we read them, which was also something that came out of the COVID project. Camus was suddenly being read for forms of realism all of a sudden. So for me, the sort of the importance of the cluster came from this sort of understanding that how and why we read has for so long been bound up with forms of aspiration, education, self-fashioning, self-improvement, leisure, of course, curiosity, and that books and readers have a sort of symbiotic relationship, which often a lot of literary scholarship focuses on the sort of text, if you like. So it was a way of getting back to how we read and why. And of course, this has sort of weighty categories behind it: cultural, political, personal. And it was about getting to grips with that. And also to problematize some of the theories about reading or received notions, which again is how the COVID project really started. Because if you remember, 6 years ago, people were saying, now you've got all the time in the world, you can read Proust or Tolstoy, pick your Moby Dick, but that isn't the reality. And sort of to elaborate on the significance, I was thinking about how the cluster came about. So it was partly from my own research, but also this cluster actually came out of an English Shared Futures panel last year at York, which was co-organised by me and Claire Lees and Michael Durrant from the Institute of English Studies. And for that panel, we simply asked people to come along and talk about a book or reading that had been important to them professionally, personally. And they had free range. They could talk about the materiality, the relationship between that and their sort of lifelong careers or work. And that was a really fascinating event, because I think, again, as scholars, we sometimes don't do that enough, which maybe could be part of our sort of public relations work, if you like, or advocacy, to think about why we read and how. And to go back a step further is actually, you know this, Gail, it was your telling me in a bookshop, which is fitting, that you owned, fortunately, this first edition of Middlemarch. And then in your panel and cluster contribution, you outline this wonderful story about how this particular book goes from Westminster to a mansion in Renfrewshire to an Oxfam bookshop in East Anglia, and then ends up in your home in London. And I think for me, this story sort of illustrated the sort of takeaways of why reading matters, from the materiality of the object itself, to the personal connections Richard pointed to, and also to your own scholarly work, and also to a life that, and to a large extent, has been shaped by and for reading. So that was sort of the inspirational sort of anecdote, if you like. And what also becomes clear when you work with actual readers rather than just theories of reading is how difficult, complex, and rich reading can be. So Becky Fisher, who's the CEO of the English Association, has a wonderful post on the cluster where she captures those sort of realities of reading, I'd say, in a very moving way. She writes in that about how A.F. Byatt's The Virgin in the Garden was a book that early in her life had opened up potential ways of living and being and ideas about the future. But it was a book that she just couldn't read when, understandably, she was on her own in a maternity ward during COVID. And perhaps surprisingly, the book that sort of reignited her ability to read, she says in that post, it was John Guillory's Professing Criticism. So maybe an unexpected turn there. And as she writes, it sort of, that book of, literary sociology, literary history, sort of reignited the passion that she had for reading and opened up that opportunity again. And she writes, I think in a very moving way at the end, she says, "These days I snatch words whenever I can, grateful for the books that have changed my life." And to me, those two examples, and I could have talked about other examples from the cluster, show both how books change, as I've said, depending on when and where we read them. And they also show the complexities of reading, which entail, all the richness and complexities and problems, as well as the joys and pleasure. So I think part of the cluster is about getting a sort of rounded view on reading, which isn't a sort of one-dimensional message. And it shows, I think, how reading and books can make things happen. And change the way we live, sometimes in expected ways, but in other times sort of in very surprising ways as well. And I think they show why reading matters, and matters in sort of multiple senses. And so, and obviously this work I've been aligned with Andrew in his work on the National Year of Reading. I think it's why, to me, that's why we should celebrate reading and also champion it, particularly at this point in reading's long history. So I think I'll end there, Gail, if that's okay.
That's great. Thank you very much, Ben. And I loved thinking about Middlemarch in that slightly different way. It's really engaging and very inspiring for me to read other people's testimonies about the importance of reading. And we've been thinking about English and reading already in quite a variety of ways, which are both very private, which get amplified if we share that private experience, but also the ways in which English and reading have very important public ramifications and public status too. So I'd like to move on to Ralph, who led the way with the campaign in January, with a month that was very collegial, that brought in lots of colleagues, not just from your home institution. So that was terrific, but it also showed how English engages, or how we can engage through and with English with some really pressing issues around climate change and the environment. And it would be really interesting to think a bit about how and why English is such an important tool in this kind of political engagement, and what your experience of how that was maybe amplified was during January.
Thanks, Gail. Yeah, the experience for me was very encouraging and inspiring, really. I mean, I came to it with having been working on and trying to develop ways in which English can contribute to engagement with the biodiversity and environmental crisis we face, and speaking with civil servants and other kind of educator groups about how a new GCSE in natural history might well and helpfully incorporate art side, English side elements. What I did with the month of blogs was actually reach out to a lot of different colleagues, both in Bristol but also in other HE institutions right across the country, and also with people working in the secondary sector in this. And what was great about that was that I expected to, discover good work was going on, but was surprised by how much energy there is in this area, both in HE, but also in schools. And I think it was meeting and coming across inspiring and progressive, cutting-edge teaching at secondary level, where teachers are making the set texts, which sometimes seem quite restrictive, but making those set texts speak to the environmental questions which students, like all of us, which young people, like all of us, are having to kind of start to deal with and start to think about, and which they find difficult to contemplate, and which provoke anxiety and distress. So that to find that even within what seems like a very restrictive GCSE sometimes, and which has had, I think, quite deleterious effects on take-up, as Andrew's been saying, you can teach these things in such a way as to make them really sing. The other thing about it is that it brings forward, or these teachers were bringing forward, I suppose what I'm saying is that the experience of seeing that at work in secondary has had effects on my own pedagogies at HE level, and the sense I have that reading of a scholarly kind right through HE can very helpfully and profitably incorporate the creative side of reading and the creative side of writing, which was absolutely going on at school level. And it's made me be more receptive to the idea that you can teach outside. So that now with students, and it's easier in some ways with students because you don't have so many of the same health and safety issues, you can simply say to students, right, we're going to go for a walk with this text. We're going to take it out into the school grounds, the campus. And that's something which I'm also developing in my own sort of development of teaching materials, to find ways in which you can bring the teaching of literature into the school grounds, into locality, into space, and that this refreshes not only their sense of the space but their sense of text. So in terms of pedagogy and in terms of inspiration, it was great. I think thirdly, the thing about it would be to say that the process of reading, the skills of reading which we're talking about, are actually skills which you need in order to see nature, and that to engage with the natural world is a process of reading, and it's a process of reading which is just as holistic, just as interpersonal as the kind of reading we do with texts, and that sense that the texts can inform nature, but nature can inform text, and the reading process is true for both of them. That's something I think I've discovered. And the last thing I'd say about it is that in terms of advocacy, I had to learn quite a lot about social media, which was not my bag at all. And the second thing I'd say about it is that advocacy like this teaches you, requires of you patience, persistence, a willingness to say the thing again, becoming accustomed to your voice not having weight. So I think as a teacher, I'm pretty used to, for all my liberal opinions and liberal values, I'm used to being taken seriously and listened to. And in advocacy, you have to confront the frequent experience of people turning a deaf ear to what you say, and you have to say it again. and not lose confidence in the truth of what you say, even when people aren't interested.
Okay.
That's it.
Thank you. Well, that has been interesting nonetheless. Thank you very much, Rolf. But I think that point about advocacy is really key. I mean, one of the first things we found out in the campaign was it wasn't enough just to have one iteration of English Creates. It's our third year, and we're kind of ringing the changes every year and saying even more important things. And I think there is evidence that we're cutting through, but that repetition is really, really critical. And I think we're all involved in that, which is fantastic. I'd like to move to Nicky now. Who's been doing some work on engaging with and building communities with literature. And we've talked very generally about English so far and reading, but you're specifically interested in the literary and in poetry in your work in communities. And I wonder if you could speak to what is it about the literary that's appealed to people, and what have they responded to in literary terms in the text that you've been working with?
Great, thanks, Gail. Yeah, so I was, over the course of March, when I was kind of curating accounts from a number of projects that I've worked on with lots of other colleagues that are really kind of place-based and quite policy-shaped projects. So they were projects that were looking at the ways in which communities, the kind of lived experience, the place agenda, the ways in which people feel about their places and how they respond to different policy interventions, particularly the pride in place. That was the thing that was kind of a focus for us. How do people feel about pride in place? And I was really aware when we went into this, we had these, values of co-production, of working with communities and finding ways in which the communities wanted to articulate themselves on the one hand, and also a kind of policy agenda that's been really led, if it's used literature at all, by narrative, by stories, that there's lots and lots of literature around how narrative is really important to policymakers. Mm-hmm. And there's whole kind of theories within policy studies. What we were struck by really early on in the project was when we said to communities, what kind of creative practice do we want to work with? What do we want to do? We were often asked for poets. And so we lent into that as these projects developed and worked with different kinds of poets in different kinds of places, really led by what the community's interest. And I think there are three different things that came out of that I think is useful to share here. Why poetry, I think, particularly was important. And the first one is about process. So we worked with poets who were writing zines with communities. We worked with poets who were writing collages, cut and paste aesthetics with communities. And we worked with poets who were writing kind of couplets, rhyming these kind of traditional rhyming couplets with communities. And what was really interesting when you work with a community in creating a poem is that it brings up not an individual voice, not a lyrical eye, not a sense of authorship, but actually the opposite, a sense of debate, a sense of discussion, and also a sense of decision. So in the processes that we kind of developed across the projects, communities would have to write their own lines and then bring their lines together and decide on writing a poem. And what was really, really interesting is that they had to write a poem that represented that sense of place. But what poetry allowed for, in its own specific way, is that identification to remain ambiguous, to remain nuanced. So communities would make a decision about what it was, but what that meant could be inflected in lots of different ways. So these poems remain very open as well as very kind of decided, I think. And that was a really important thing, the process. The second thing that poetry allowed, and why communities were drawn to poetry, is that it allowed us, the communities could literally own these poems and could place these poems where they wanted to be placed and have a record of their discussion, have a record of the nature of this intervention. So in Darlington's got a very famous history in the origins of the trains in Britain, and they wanted their poem to be in the train station. So we could have this Darlington poem, which has got lots of different voices and lots of different accounts of Darlington, but up in the train station. In Hereford, we worked, I think lots of people who are doing community engagement are doing this in lots of different ways now, in these empty shops, thinking about the high streets. And these poems could fill the high streets, poems by young people could fill these empty shops and high streets, and again be another way of facing out to the community and recording their voice and leaving it there. On the Isle of Wight, the poems became sound texts that could use the sound of the sea and use that sense of the island, specificity of the island. So poems also, they're very specific, but they also leave a kind of permanent record that the community can own, and I think that was really important. And the third thing that poetry could do, which I think is particularly valuable to the literary critic, is there's something very odd about using poetry to produce what policymakers call qualitative data. Very instrumental about what we're doing, like, are these poems, are these kinds of questions? But poetry can also reflect on that. It's got this amazing self-reflective kind of plasticity So we employed another poet, lots of different poets, but the poet Ella Frears, and we gave her all of our texts, and we gave her a kind of research material, and she did this fantastic poem for us called How Proud, thinking about the what it means for policymakers to want motions as a kind of form of governance. And she could reflect on the whole project. So offer this kind of meta level of critique as well that we then shared with the policymakers who'd asked us to think about these questions, and that we could say, actually, the project itself is problematic. So we're doing it, but we're also holding it at a critical distance, and poetry had that within it as well. So I think poetry was really, really important. And what was so great is that this idea that it was difficult or was inaccessible or that it was elite, we didn't find that anywhere. There's a real desire and an enthusiasm for poetry from communities, but also from kind of the kind of umbrella organisations, from local authorities and from policymakers too, were surprisingly receptive to this as a form of data, to this as a form of inquiry, which just kind of felt great. And then you could talk about other kinds of poems. You know, we're working with poets who could talk about their own practice and extend that to other kinds of readings.
That's fantastic. I'm feeling so inspired by everything I'm hearing, and I'm in the subject already. But that's wonderful, and I think the emphasis on place is going to be hopefully going to be increasingly important. We hear from Mr. Burnham, so that would be hopefully that will put us front and centre of those debates. One of the big debates that we're involved in, and that Rodney, I'm sure, is involved in, is around the use of AI and its intersections with English studies. They often seem quite inimical things. So, Rodney, perhaps you could speak to your experience of teaching AI and of curating with your students this month on AI, which is there in the blog for us all to have a look at. You're muted, Rodney.
Thank you, Gail. I feel almost like after listening to all of this inspiring and enlightening work on reading and creativity, that I'm sort of throwing a spanner in the works by talking about a technology which many of us feel really threatens some of the things that we hold dear when it comes to creative expression, when it comes to writing, when it comes to individualism, and when it comes to really what we do in our subject. And even in our institutions, we have experienced the kind of threat that AI has posed to our traditional ways of assessing students. We've all felt the experience of, combing through our students' essays for words like delve and, wondering if, maybe they didn't actually write what they said they wrote, and also the very real fears that about how the use of AI can actually de-skill our students, can sort of offload the kind of thinking and kind of criticality that we really want to give to our students. And we also see how AI is in many ways upending the literary world. I mean, I'm sure you're all aware of the recent Commonwealth Short Story Prize, which was apparently apparently written or partially written by AI. And so wondering, questions about authorships, questions about accountability really, really come to the fore. But at the same time, there are also writers of English and other languages that are incorporating AI into their writing. I recently read a novel called Sympathy Tower Tokyo by a Japanese writer, Ria Kudan, in which conversations with a large language model with an AI are actually part of the novel, and the AI is a kind of self-generated character in the novel. And so there are also interesting things happening. So along with all of the threat discourse, there is also, in some ways, some things that we as scholars of English might feel in some ways happy about. I mean, for me, what is perhaps quite interesting is the way large language models and AI have suddenly centered language as a very, very important skill and a very, very important commodity in a way. So now, if you want to make a website, if you want to make a piece of software, it really doesn't depend on whether you're able to write Python or code or anything like that. It really depends on your ability to use language, and your ability to use language well determines whether or not you're going to be successful in these kinds of endeavors. I was speaking to some colleagues in graphic design, and they told me that all of a sudden art history majors are getting jobs, whereas before it was traditionally one of those majors that, well, you probably will be working at Starbucks for a while, and they're actually getting jobs in graphic design companies that are using large language models to generate images because they know how to talk about art. They know how to use language to describe pictures. They are familiar with artists and artistic movements that they can talk about in order to generate certain kinds of images using the AI. So in many ways, this is providing for us, our students, a lot of interesting work opportunities that they may not have had before. And I think it's important for us to kind of help them to understand what those opportunities might be. But I think for me, the best thing about AI is that it is what I call a provocative technology. It is a technology that provokes us. It provokes us and our students to ask questions like, what exactly is creativity? What do we mean by creativity? What is creative writing? What makes a piece of writing creative? What is writing to begin with? What is the act of writing? And what is reading? What is language? And what do we mean when language is generated? What's the difference between when a machine generates language and when a human generates language? Is there a mind behind language? How do we converse with conversational partners that we know are not human, but somehow we are compelled to treat them as human? And so, I mean, for me as a linguist, these are all very, very interesting questions, but I think they're also very, very important questions for our students to be asking. Questions about what is language, and questions about what does it mean to be human to begin with. And I think it's actually good that we are being forced to ask these questions, that this technology is really pushing these questions to the forefront, because they've always been in the background in our subject and always been the kind of foundation of our subject, but somehow not discussed quite as explicitly as we have to start discussing them now. And so I think that's a good thing. Before this meeting today, I was having breakfast. I was listening to a podcast that I like called Pod Save the UK. And they had a panelist on who was talking about her experience of going to Davos and engaging in a debate about AI. And she said, and there was the pro side and the anti side, and I was on the anti side, and we won. And I thought about that, and I kind of wondered, like, what exactly does it mean? What does it mean, first of all, to be pro or anti-AI? And what does it mean to actually win this debate in a place like Davos? And how is that actually going to impact the ways AI is going to affect our students, affect our economy, affect our societies? And so I am really much more interested in the kind of debate that my students had in my language and digital media which resulted in these social media posts for English Creates Futures, because I think what you see in these posts is not a kind of for or against kind of positioning. What you see is a kind of complexity of feelings and emotions and analyses. So of course there's fear, and there's even anger, and there's skepticism, and there's this kind of criticality, but there's also a kind of curiosity, a kind of wonder, a kind of even enchantment that's involved when we are able to talk to a machine. And as people who have who are familiar with English literature, I think we've got to take that enchantment seriously. It's been written about for centuries, the kind of enchantment of being able to talk to machines and being able to engage with beings that are kind of on that edge of sentience, and what that means and what that does to us and how it reflects our own souls and our own intellects back to one another. And so you will see they deal with all sorts of issues. They deal with creativity. They deal with what's the difference between human and AI writing in a kind of linguistic way, how AI reproduce certain kinds of stereotypes, the effect that AI is having on our thinking, how AI actually works, right? And what students are doing with AI, often in rather humorous ways. They were talking about that. And you can also see they've talked about these things in a lot of different formats that are perhaps different from some of the formats we saw in the other topics for the blog posts, including short videos, including memes. And I mean, I was actually quite taken and quite inspired by their use of their native genres to try to wrestle with this issue, particularly genres like a meme, which in some ways are really fascinating genres. They're a bit like metaphors because they don't necessarily pin down meaning. They actually expand meaning and expand possibilities for discussion. And so I think often when we think about criticality and we think about teaching our students about criticality, it's too easy to mistake criticality for ideological positioning, and to think that criticality means taking a position perhaps against neoliberalism or against other things that we may agree are a kind of threat to the things that we hold dear. But I think what I learned from this exercise is that really engaging them with criticality is engaging them with their ambivalence, engaging them with all of the complex feelings they are having in being in the very crucible of this technology in a way that we are not, because we have our careers where of course our subject is under threat, but we're all, I think, quite senior and we're quite secure, and our students are in a situation where they just don't know what's going to happen in the future in many ways, and in many ways that are also talked about in some of the other subjects that the blogs dealt with, things like the environment and climate change. They don't know what's going to happen, and so that allow them to feel around, not just think around, but feel around these different ambivalencies, these different emotions they're having, was, I think, very inspiring for me. Because when it comes to AI, I think the real emotion most of us feel is powerlessness. We feel like there are these big tech companies who are just, speeding forward with these technologies and building these huge data centers, and these politicians are just egging them on and funding them, and that there's very little that we can do. And so I think when it comes to thinking about advocacy and AI in our subject, I think the most important thing that we can advocate for is agency. And that agency comes on an individual level, from students having the opportunity to think and talk about what they think about AI and how they would like AI to be used in their subjects, and also local agency in classrooms, in universities, in organizations, in charities, in all sorts of in locales to take up the Andy Burnham theme that everyone seems to be interested in now. And so one thing that we've been trying to do in our department is to try to bring AI as a problem back to the students, rather than trying to tell them what they should think of AI, to get them to take agency. So, for example, for our MA, we have we have this kind of practice where we have the university has an AI policy, but it's a very vague AI policy. It's like, don't use AI to cheat sort of thing. I think it's probably the same in most of your institutions. And so we take this vague AI policy and we ask the MA students to come up with their own AI policy, to put the specifics in that, to say, we think AI should be used for this, should not be used for this, can be used for this, might be used for that, and to get them to articulate. And then that becomes the policy that we use as lecturers to assess their work. And so they have ownership over their AI policy. They have ownership over how they think they can and should use AI. And we think that that is resulting in, less what we might call misuse of AI in their assignments, but also, even more important, giving them the chance to have those conversations. Because, as I say, AI is a provocative technology, and when we have conversations about AI, we are having conversations about literacy, we're having conversations about academic honesty, we're having conversations about intelligence. And these are the conversations that I think we want our students to be having.
Thank you very much, Rodney. I think that point about agency is one that we can probably all share in massively. I think that's actually a key commonality between what we've been hearing from each of you this morning. I've been noticing, as you probably have too, that the chat's been quite busy. So I'm going to ask Harvey to collate some and communicate with us some of the questions that have been coming through on the chat. We've got about 15-20 minutes to take some questions. Harvey, over to you for
thanks, Gail. Not so much in terms of direct questions, but actually a lot of reflection and a really brilliant record developing of the work that's been going on the subject, inspired by what the panelists have been saying. Actually, I just wanted to pick out a few things. Plenty of attendees today reflecting on their work with and relationships with libraries, whether libraries when they were themselves students or bringing in libraries into their teaching, taking classes out, in response to Ralph's work outside of the classroom and feeling empowered to do that. But actually, what I'm seeing here is actually a kind of developing response to one of the attendees' kind of not questions, but responses about how we compile and bring together all of the great work that's being done on the subject and make that more legible. And I guess I was just reflecting on how today absolutely is doing that, showcasing and making legible the fantastic work that's being done around CPD, around the pedagogy, and materials that we can access. A question has come in for Andrew. This is from Zoe Carroll. I teach mature students and increasing numbers of students in their early 20s, 30s and 40s. They report that they struggle to concentrate on getting through the set texts at all. And they tell her that they don't have a fast enough reading speed to keep up with the kind of study calendar. They depend increasingly on audiobooks, but this is not ideal to encourage close reading. Can you share any strategies to encourage these students? And actually that chimes with a few reflections, particularly on what you were saying, Andrew, about the year of reading. And I don't know if this is quite right way to phrase it, but democratizing or leveling out the kinds of ways we access the written word through digital technologies, through traditional formats, but also importantly, audiobooks. So yeah, Zoe's asking, can you share any strategies to encourage these students?
I'll do my best. If I had a quick answer, we'd solve quite a lot. But I do think as well that I think Zoe's point is important, that actually quite often, while we encourage children to read through a variety of formats, for close reading, slow reading, whatever you want to call it, particularly working in an academic environment, text is still best, really. So sometimes we need to be thinking around how do we surround text with audio or screen reading or comics or whatever it might be, but still returning to that text. So it might be looking at the variety of formats, but also returning to the text that you need them to when you are doing that particular close reading in preparation for assessments. So you might want to just think about how you interleave different formats through your course. I think one thing that is worth thinking about, and I'm sure that you do this already, but I do say this to teachers in schools as well, is to think about the curation of the set texts that you're asking them to read, and is readability taken into account when you're making those selections, as well as, are these the best quality text, or are they illuminating a particular theme or topic, but are they actually text that people would want to read as well? So do kind of have that in mind when you're thinking about things. And I think one thing that I was reflecting on through some of the prior conversations as well, particularly about Middlemarch, is how you make those connections between the contemporary and the canonical in your selection choices. I'm sure everyone's aware of the work of Darren Chetty and Beyond the Secret Garden, that actually the writers of contemporary diverse fiction have been influenced by the canonical texts before them, and how you can use that to support people's interest in those canonical texts sometimes. And this is the wrong group of people to try to work this through with, because I'm not a literacy scholar, but in terms of thinking of Middlemarch, particularly if somebody's enjoyed something like The Information by Martin Amis, which was heavily influenced by Middlemarch, you could talk about how you would enjoy the contemporary fiction more by basing that around that deeper understanding of the work that's influenced and gone before it. So building those connections through between different books and different formats of text, I think might be one way to help with this. I think the other thing and again, I say this to teachers, is not to give up on them. Again, I'm basing this on the sample size of one of my son who's just finished his English literature GCSE and wasn't required to read a whole book all the way through that course, and it was taught almost entirely by excerpt, because the teachers have this expectation that children now won't be able to read whole novels. But you then build that vicious cycle of low expectations. So actually persevering with longer novels sometimes can build that reading stamina that has been lost sometimes. So I think you need, again, to balance the short form with the long form in that right way. So sometimes it's about getting to know your student groups, what interests them, helping them to make those connections, thinking about the range of formats and deploying them in the right way through your courses, but also not having that expectation that they won't be able to read a novel all the time, that actually sometimes we do need to encourage and support them and make the time in the course for them to be able to do that.
Thank you. If I could just jump in for a second, Harvey, I think I would just say that, you know, fetishizing the kind of single volume text, which is how most of us read now, is perhaps not the most helpful way of doing it either. Victorian novels are often written serially, and people have read them over months, if not a whole year. So actually thinking more creatively about replicating that experience possibly, and not getting too hung up on the fact that you have a great brick in front of you that needs to be conquered. If you can conquer a brick, you know, just thinking, being kinder to ourselves as readers actually can be really helpful and really permissive. Sorry, Harvey, back to you.
I was just thinking that would be music to my colleague at Royal Holloway's ears, who runs a Reading Like a Victorian course where they engage with the weekly and the monthly serialization of texts.
I did a middle in the George Eliot bicentenary. We did reading experience where we read the 8 books of Middlemarch as they came out in monthly parts, and the reading experience was really different and kind of permissive. You kind of lived with it and inhabited that space. Anyway, too much Middlemarch possibly this morning. But...
Richard, did you want to come on before I pivot to another question?
Yeah, if that's all right, because I just that word about being sort of permitted to read sort of really struck home, because I think lots of sort of older students sometimes come in to say that they've sort of lost their confidence in reading, and that the one thing they really gain through studying again later in life is this kind of sense of confidence and the feeling that they are allowed to study. So many students might come saying that they didn't feel permitted to study or read when they were younger, to study literature, for example. They studied something else to please somebody else, but later they're allowed to sort of follow their own heart and their own interests. So that idea about feeling permitted and allowed and giving the confidence to study, I think, is an important one. It just the way you use the word sort of resonated.
Thank you, Richard. I'm going to jump to a question from actually one of my colleagues, Bob Eagleston, who's really interested in inviting you to reflect and talk on about the ways in which English has been campaigning to influence policymakers and the media in recent times. So I wonder if anyone wants to jump in on that.
I wonder if, Ben, if you'd like to speak to that, because you've been involved in a kind of, not exactly a side hustle, but an extension of the English Creates campaign recently.
Yeah, it's so it does come out of English Creates, and what I've been working on with colleagues here and the IES and EA is basically trying to influence politicians, policymakers, get people in the media on board. And we had a meeting in February at Senate House where we brought together people from across the discipline, a Lord, which led to a parliamentary breakfast meeting last month at the end of June. There were 20 of us there. From Lord Smith was there, Lord Baker, and Samir Ahmed from the BBC broadcaster. I've put the link in the chat. You can see it there. And the idea was to get people in the same room from the discipline, including us and teachers, some students, and also the people who I guess sort of run the country in various ways, and to give them the facts about English. Actually, that was part of it. A lot of this is about myth busting, and I think it was successful. We managed to get these people on board to endorse the campaign and also to think about becoming champions of the discipline. We provided them, as I said, with the sort of facts and figures that they need, and the work, as I think was said earlier by Ralph and maybe Gail, that it's not just that messages need repeating, the work just needs to carry on. Scientists have known this for a long time and have been doing this sort of work. So the aim, to answer Bob's question in a way, was to create this, and he was part of it, was to create this charter for change where we are asking for people to step up, if you like, to support the discipline, to champion the discipline, to actually realize what it does. So you can think about that in economic terms. The contribution to the exchequer is, I think, around 120 billion from the creative industries. English is an important subject, and yet it's often, as we know, it's often talked down. So it's hopefully the campaigning is about changing that and, I don't know, turning the tide. And so I think this year has actually been a great momentum build for us. And it, as I said, it continues. And you can read the Charter of Change. And I put some other links in the chat. Gail, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to this on campaigning, because obviously you created English Creates initially.
Well, yeah, I suppose I will answer, but I'll answer with an anecdote, if I may, which is that on Monday evening I was in the pub with my older daughter, and we heard a bloke at the table next to us chatting. I mean, he's kind of middle-aged business type person chatting to his friend, and I think they must have been talking about kids' GCSE choices or something. And he said, "Well, English is just about knowing how to use the right long words in the right place, isn't it?" And Lily looked very nervous because she thought I might be going to have a word with him, which is my great temptation. But and I just thought that's incredibly reductive, and I was infuriated. But then I just thought, and particularly after listening to this panel, which has been really brilliant, how much that bloke and other people who think like that are missing out on. Mm-hmm. So I think we just need to keep going, partly because of all the reasons you've articulated, plus the economic and political reasons that are really important for how and why English should keep going, because it really does speak to the industrial strategy. It speaks to government policies and government priorities, but it also speaks to, the potential for people's growth through English and their enjoyment and their pleasure. We've all been talking about community building. It is such a fundamental block of that. Language, literature are absolutely foundational to all of these things we've been talking about, and all the things that I think everyone would aspire to for themselves, their communities, their families. It's massive, and I think we just need to keep going, but we need to keep going in the spirit of enjoyment and collegiality ourselves. And this panel has really demonstrated that, and I'm sure that's quite a lot of the energy that we bring to classrooms and to our engagements with communities and to school kids. So it's, yeah, and I think the campaigning kind of has to basically be the most intense version we can possibly make of all those goods that English can bring. On the collegiality note, maybe I'll make a request. I've put the charter in the chat, so if everyone wants to take it, print it, share it as widely as possible, that would help. That would be great. Yes, thank you. I think, Harvey, I'm going to pass back to you because there are still more questions coming through.
I've got one thing to add, and then one question that's just come in. I can feel Bob giving me the kind of digital kick in the shins under the table, telling me to mention that, of course, there's an opportunity coming up from September to all feed back into the new national curriculum covering all of the subjects. So one thing we can all do in terms of that subject advocacy is engage from all of our myriad perspectives and relationships to the subject on how the GCSE curriculum in particular is being developed. So I think that's opening from September, if I'm correct. But yeah, we've got a question in from Adia, and this is directed to Rodney. I found it interesting how you emphasized agency. I also found it really interesting. The internet is becoming increasingly saturated with AI content, and there are concerns about AI self-cannibalizing due to being trained on more AI-generated data. Do you think this could make human language and writing more valuable? And how can we, or can we indeed, use English as a discipline to retain agency over language rather than just adapting to this new world of AI?
It's a very good question. It's a very complicated question, to which I won't pretend to have an answer, but I do think I have some thoughts. I think that I have always seen myself primarily as a teacher of literacy. Digital literacies and literacies more broadly has been my research area for many years. And in the way we think about literacy in my field, it is not just about reading and writing, but it's about reading and writing in order to do things. Reading and writing as part of social practices, that we are always reading in order to be a certain kind of person, or to do a certain kind of thing, or to become a certain kind of thing. And to focus on literacy not just as a matter of, this kind of cognitive exercise of understanding text or even analyzing text, but to think more about what are the social actions, what are the social practices that are involved around literacy, and how do different kinds of literacy and how do different kinds of text enable or constrain our agency, enable or constrain our ability to do different things and our ability to be different kinds of people. And so this is also the way I want my students to be thinking about digital media in general, but also AI in general. What kind of literacies do we need in order to maintain that agency, in order to be able to perhaps use AI to do certain things, or understand the way AI is actually constraining our action or directing our action or making us think or feel or be certain kinds of people. So these are really, really important kinds of aspects of agency. Could you just say the question one more time, because I think there was something else.
Rodney, I fear we're running out of time a bit.
Okay, yeah. I think that's enough then. Yeah.
No, I think you got to the heart of that. We've slightly overrun, and I don't want to deprive people of a break, because it's been a very intense experience. I mean, perhaps we need to decompress slightly. But that's been absolutely brilliant. I've enjoyed this so much. So thank you very much to the speakers. Thank you, audience, for your participation in the chat, which I think we'll all get the chance to have a look through as the day goes on. I think the thing I'm going to take away from this is Rodney's final point, actually the point that's been made by all of you in some form or another about agency and the strength of collaboration. So can I invoke, and just really to kind of back up what Ben said, we have campaigns that are going. You can find out about them on the UE website. English Association also has a lot of information, which is extremely useful. So please amplify those campaigns, join in with those campaigns where you can. Make sure your colleagues know about them, take them out to schools when you go on schools visits. There's a lot of information, a lot of posters that we can share. So I think if we work together, we're a huge body, our subject discipline, and we can do a lot when we work together and collaborate, which has been the other key word which has come out this morning. So thank you very much indeed, colleagues, both listening and speaking. So we've got a 12-minute break now. We're reconvening at 11:30 with a panel curated by Alistair Brown from Durham on social media influence and online communities, which looks fantastic. So we'll see you all again then. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you.